EU261. If you're excited about this video, just imagine how exciting it's been to research and script it. Whenever you release a video on YouTube, it ranks it against the 9 last videos that you released. I'm fully expecting this video to rank as number 10 at the very bottom of the list, but it's a video I think I need to make. It's a video that will be useful on the channel, and if you need this information, it will be there waiting for you when that day comes. So put very simply, EU261 is a regulation that requires airlines to sometimes pay compensation to some of their customers in some circumstances. There's quite a few qualifications in that sentence, which gives you a clue as to why this video needs to be as long as it is. So why make this video now? Well, I recently flew on Iberia from Madrid on a flight that ended up arriving into Bogota more than 3 hours late, which should produce a slam dunk claim for compensation under these regulations. So I thought it was time to make this video about EU261 to share when you might be able to make a claim. And as I have a live claim ongoing, I can illustrate this video with my personal experience. I hereby promise to try hard to make this video as interesting as possible, so if that doesn't sound completely awful, stick around. Hi, I'm Matt. I've lived in 5 countries on 4 continents. I've flown over 1.4 million miles. I've visited over 100 countries, every American state, but I'm nowhere near done. So subscribe and you might pick up some hacks, hints and tips to make your next trip better. So what is EU261? Well, in 2004, the European Union created a regulation called the Air Passengers Rights Regulation 2004. It came into force in 2005, but as I think it was the 261st regulation passed in 2004, it got the name EU261. Cool name, cool rule. It was intended to clamp down on airlines overbooking flights and cancelling them, but what ended up happening is that they would just delay flights indefinitely to avoid having to pay compensation on cancellation. So the regulation has been extended over the years into what we have now. Now, I don't talk about politics on this channel, but some of you may have noticed a thing called Brexit. Whilst we were promised an end to this sort of busybody interventionist EU regulation, the British government obviously decided that this rule was actually quite good, so it has been written across into UK law. I suspect the fact that it's quite a popular regulation played a part in that decision. So it was adopted into UK law as part of the catchily named European Union (Withdrawal) Act 2018, but seems to have adopted the much more convenient nickname of UK 261. It's a law, so it's obviously complicated, and a number of lawsuits have needed to be settled to actually clarify what the law actually means in some areas. So I've done my very best to get everything right, but I am not a lawyer. And even if I was, there is no way I could cover every single nuance of this legislation. So I apologise in advance if I missed anything or got anything wrong, and as usual I'll pin a comment at the top of the comment section below where I'll put any updates to this video that are required. So what flights does it cover? Well, this bit's relatively simple. It covers any flight leaving an EU or a UK airport on any airline. And it extends to some non-EU territories too. So flights departing Iceland, Norway and Switzerland are covered. Oddly, perhaps, the Faroe Islands, Gibraltar and the Channel Islands are not covered, but the Canaries and Madeira are. And overseas territories that are technically part of an EU member are included too. So that's places like St Martin, Réunion and French Guiana, all of which are technically part of France. And that's a flight on any airline. So a flight from Amsterdam to Chicago on KLM is covered, and a flight from Amsterdam to Chicago on Delta Airlines is also covered. And it covers your entire booking. So if you flew from Frankfurt to Washington and that flight was on time, but you had a connection on the same booking from Washington to somewhere else, if that flight ends up being delayed, you are then covered by EU261. But it has to be a reservation on the same booking. So this regulation covers quite a lot of flights, and some flights you might not expect. It also covers flights to the EU or the UK, provided it's on an airline from one of those territories. So a KLM flight from Chicago to Amsterdam would be covered, but a Delta flight from Chicago to Amsterdam would not be covered. And it's the operating airline that counts. So if you're on a Delta flight number from Chicago to Amsterdam, but it's operated by a KLM plane, you are covered. Any flight from a non-EU UK destination to another non-EU UK destination is not covered. So an Avianca flight from Bogota to Panama City is obviously not going to be covered. But a Blue Islands flight from Jersey to Guernsey also would not be covered, as neither of them are part of the UK or the EU. Good! Now this regulation applies to paid and reward fares. After all, you have paid for your reward fare, albeit in the form of points. It doesn't cover free travel or tickets not available to the general public. So if you're on a discounted staff fare, it's not going to be covered. And one final important point on coverage. It applies to all travellers regardless of nationality. You don't have to be a citizen of the EU or the UK to be able to make a claim. One recurring theme in all of this is that airlines do an abysmal job of communicating your rights to you as a passenger. So many people that are travelling on flights that are delayed will have no idea that they are eligible for compensation. But Australians or Americans flying on a delayed intra-EU flight are eligible for compensation just as everybody else is. So that's what flights are covered, and the regulation kicks in when there is a delay or a cancellation. So let's cover cancellations first, as that's the easiest bit. Easier bit. And once again, there's some fine print as to exactly when a cancellation qualifies. If a flight you're booked on is cancelled more than 2 weeks away from travel, you're not covered. Which is why you tend to see cancellations made about 15 days before the date of travel. Airlines are required to give you an alternative, and there are various regulations in force governing what they must do. But there's no compensation available through EU261 if your cancellation comes more than 2 weeks from travel. If you're cancelled within 14 and 7 days of your date of travel, and you are rebooked on a flight that arrives no more than 4 hours later than the original booking, which also departs no earlier than 2 hours before the original booking, you are not eligible for EU261 compensation. And if you are cancelled within a week of travel and you are rebooked on a flight that arrives no more than 2 hours later than originally booked and departs no earlier than 1 hour before you were originally booked, you also don't qualify. All this stuff sort of makes sense, but you really do feel that it is overcomplicated. So if you are cancelled in a way that qualifies, there are 3 elements of EU261 that kick in. The first is a duty of care, which I'll talk about in a moment. The second is compensation, which I'll also talk about in a moment. But the third is that you are entitled to a rebooking, which must be at the earliest opportunity and under comparable conditions. This is most likely going to be relevant if you're cancelled on the day of travel, because if you're cancelled earlier than that, the airline's got a reasonable amount of time to rebook you on something. Now, at the earliest opportunity and under comparable conditions seem to be relatively straightforward English phrases that should be easy to understand. And they suggest to me that your airline should be happy to book you on another airline in order to satisfy those conditions. But airlines hate doing this, as it's expensive for them, and they will often refuse to do so, even if that would seem to be a breach of their obligations under EU261. But there's no real punishment system in place if the airlines don't do what they are required to do. I've said before that airlines often won't tell you what your rights are and will do quite a lot to get out of their obligations. But you do hear plenty of stories of airlines that do the decent thing and book you onto an alternate airline, and indeed that can be quite a win, because you might end up on an airline that's heaps better than the one that you originally booked with. Now, to give the airlines a little bit of credit here, last-minute cancellations can be a complete nightmare for them. A flight back from an outstation may get cancelled late at night where there's just nobody on duty to handle the consequences. And as I mentioned before, the courts have set some precedents as regards how these rules need to be interpreted, but this is one area where it's not yet completely understood. Which brings me on to another recurring theme here, which is whether you should be active or passive when things go wrong. Now, if I was faced with a last-minute cancellation, if there was nothing suitable on the airline I was originally booked with as an alternative, if there was a comparable seat available on another airline, and if my airline was difficult to get in touch with, I would rebook myself onto that alternate flight and would worry about the consequences and the reimbursement for this later. Now, I have enough headroom on my credit cards to be able to do this, and I also have status with most airline schemes, and I also know a little bit about the regulations here, so I'd back myself in a fight with the airline down the road if I did this. There will be a small risk that I don't get my money back, or that I have to sue the airline to get it back. And remember, this area has not been completely tested through the courts yet, and I really wouldn't want to be the test case. But you want to move quickly. There may only be a handful of seats on this alternate flight, and there's now a plane full of people after them. I want to make certain that I'm getting one. Now, if my return flight is cancelled, and if I'm in no particular hurry to get home, if I'm somewhere hot and sunny as an example, I'd probably slow things down. I'd probably go to the back of the queue. And I'd sort of hope that all the available seats on other airlines were taken before the airline got round to me. That cancellation may give me a few more nights somewhere nice at the airline's expense, which brings me to the duty of care. But I have to quickly mention first that EU261 does also cover downgrades. I'll not talk about them in this video because this video is dull enough already, but at the end of the day you're going to get home even if it's not in the seat that you originally wanted to be in. But if you are downgraded, compensation will be due. So if duty of care does kick in, it's another scenario where I am inclined to be very, very active in looking after myself. And if you're going to be late arriving somewhere, the airline has a responsibility to look after you, and I'll be specific about how late that needs to be in a second. This includes food, drinks, telephone calls, and if the delay is overnight, accommodation plus transport to and from that accommodation. The airline's responsibility is far more clear-cut here than it is in the case of a rebooking, so there's less jeopardy involved if you take control of the situation. Indeed, moving quickly may be just as important here, as there may be a very small number of hotel rooms available and you want to be in one of them. I am way too old to be sleeping on airport floors. The key here is sort yourself out, keep the receipts and reclaim it from the airline later. The airline may very well sort you out, but it could take hours and they might end up not being able to do anything for you. You'll never be able to reclaim alcohol, but reasonable food, reasonable soft drinks, perhaps even toiletries and perhaps even some clothing, all should be acceptable claims. It's reported that BA won't quibble about reimbursing you up to £200 for the cost of a hotel night as well. So that should give you some idea of what's going to be accepted. Now, if you're somewhere very expensive like New York and you just can't find a room for that price, the advice is to take a screenshot of a booking engine that shows the prices that are available and submit that alongside your hire claim, and it should still be accepted. Just try to gather some evidence. So we'll backtrack a little bit here. I've talked about duty of care, but we haven't talked about when the airline is responsible for providing it. Flights fall into 3 categories, and which category your flight is in will determine when the duty of care kicks in and also the compensation that is due. This bit's relatively simple. A flight of less than 1,500 kilometres is called a Tier 1 flight. That's roughly London to Stockholm or Lisbon. 1,500 to 3,500 kilometres is known as a Tier 2 flight. That's London to roughly Cairo, but there's nowhere in North America that's that close. And any longer flight is Tier 3. Now, there is a ridiculous little bit of a detail here that says any intra-EU flight of over 3,500 kilometres classified as Tier 2. And you may think, well, the EU's not that big, but the French overseas territories may be more than 3,500 kilometres away, and you are capped at a claim at level 2. It's a small detail, but I might as well be thorough. And the duty of care kicks in if a Tier 1 flight is delayed for 2 hours, if a Tier 2 flight is delayed for 3 hours, and if a Tier 3 flight is delayed for 4 hours. And to be clear, those relate to expected arrival times. A flight may take off 3.5 hours late on a Tier 2 routing, but if it makes up time in flight and still lands less than 3 hours late, the airline has no obligation to give you the duty of care food and beverage. And one last little nugget of detail here that may well be relative is that if any flight of any length is delayed for more than 5 hours, you have the right to give up, go home and get a full refund. When we deboarded the first plane that went tech, business class passengers were sent to the right. We were told to go to the lounge where there was food and beverage, and Iberia would have considered that an adequate duty of care tick. Other passengers were steered to the left, and I couldn't really see, but I think they were given vouchers on deboarding, which would have given them access to food and beverage. And that tells me that Iberia was expecting this to be more than a 4-hour delay. It was a tier 3 flight, and so a 4-hour delay is required before that duty of care kicks in. So the last section of all of this is compensation. We've covered most of the principles here, so there's not that much more to load on. And annoyingly, the delays required for compensation to be triggered are slightly different to the delays required for duty of care to kick in. So if a tier 1 flight is 3 hours late arriving, you are entitled to €250 under the EU regs and £220 under the UK regs. So the duty of care kicks in after 2 hours, but the compensation only kicks in after 3. A tier 2 flight that is more than 3 hours late arriving entitles you to €400 or £350. The duty of care and compensation are aligned here in terms of timing. And a tier 3 flight that arrives more than 4 hours late, same as the duty of care in this case as well, entitles you to €600 or £520. And compensation must be paid in cash. Don't accept vouchers or any other form of payment. Guess what? There's some fine print. These amounts are payable if you arrive later than your scheduled time, whether that's because of a delay or because of a rescheduling after a cancellation. Your rescheduled flight doesn't have to be late. And possibly the most complicated part of all of this, bear with me. If you were rerouted as a result of a cancellation, if you arrive after your original arrival time, even by a minute, you can claim half these amounts depending on the tier of flight that you were on. There's obviously an intention that a rerouting is an inconvenience that you need to be compensated for. It even surprised me to figure this out as I was researching this video, and I think it is a very, very little known rule. And one last teeny tiny wrinkle: if you're on a tier 3 flight which arrives between 3 and 4 hours late, you can claim half the compensation. And that's the situation that I found myself in when we landed in Bogota after my Iberia flight. All of this is a great initiative and it's intended to keep the airlines honest, but I'm sure you will agree it is all a bit complicated. Oh, it took so long to record this, my battery died. So there are two last things I need to talk about, both of which are very, very significant. The first is, what does arriving mean? And this is an area where the courts have provided clarity and it is now unambiguous. It's when the plane's doors open. You can land, you can taxi somewhere and you can wait for ages, but it means you can't get off. So the landing time isn't the arrival time. It's the point when the doors open and you are then able to leave the plane. Which, unfortunately, is a very tricky data point to get your hands on because it's not generally published and the airlines generally won't tell you. So I would advise you to keep your own records, make a note of the time, perhaps even take a snap of your watch as you are stepping off the plane yourself, so you've got some independent evidence of what time you were actually able to get off the plane and so what time you actually arrived. If you gather your own evidence, the airlines will find it harder to argue with you. And secondly, compensation is only payable if the delay was the airline's fault. If there were extraordinary circumstances, they can legitimately wriggle out of their obligations. So things like volcano eruptions, civil wars and strikes shutting down entire airports are deemed extraordinary circumstances, and I think that's probably fair enough. Hurricanes and bird strikes have been ruled by the courts to be exceptional too. Being short-staffed, not having the catering carts ready, or if the purser breaks a fingernail are not extraordinary circumstances. Airlines don't want to pay, so they will come up with all sorts of excuses and reasons to avoid having to pay you. And they will also refuse to share information with you that will help you determine what the true cause actually was. Again, there's no disciplinary scheme in place here if the airlines don't do the right thing, but the courts have tended to side with the passengers in those test cases that we've been talking about. And I want to give you 3 examples here. Lightning strikes have been ruled not exceptional. They happen, they are not exceptional events, so cannot be used as an excuse to not pay compensation. If weather delayed an earlier flight that made your plane late, which made your flight late, Your flight wasn't delayed by weather, an earlier one was, and that is therefore not an exceptional circumstance which allows the airline to get out of compensating you. That's a really, really good one to know about. And if a flight is scheduled into a wintry airport, it is not exceptional if that airport receives wintry weather and it snows. The airline should have anticipated this eventuality based on its knowledge of its operations and should have had contingency plans in place. It's not exceptional. And again, that one I think is very good to know. So I made a claim. I struggled to find a place to do it on Iberia's site. Funnily enough, they don't make it easy. But a quick Google search kicked out a link. And it was actually a fairly quick and easy process. I needed the reservation code and the ticket number. This was a BA redemption ticket which gave me a 5-character Iberia reservation and a 6-character BA code, and the BA one worked and my booking was quickly found. I then needed to enter a fair amount of personal info, more than I thought was reasonable actually. Country of residence was a pain as the list had been translated into English but it was still sorted alphabetically in Spanish, so Reino Unido was what I was looking for. And as if by magic, the claim was accepted and I was promised a response within a month. An email confirmation of this swiftly followed, so I am definitely in the system. Iberia's plane broke and we arrived into Bogota 3 hours late. There were no hurricanes, volcanoes, strikes, civil wars, any of that exceptional nonsense, so this should be a very straightforward claim. We will see. So what happens if the airline denies your claim? Well, you can escalate it, but how to do so will depend on the airline. Most belong to an alternate dispute resolution scheme, an ADR as it's known. BA uses the Centre for Effective Dispute Resolution, better known as CEDA. Other airlines use different schemes. Any escalation can be a pain, but if a family of 4 is looking at €600 each, it can be very much worth it. And if all else fails, you can sue. Plenty of firms crop up when you Google this and they all seem to work on a no-win, no-fee basis. You're obviously going to give away some of your compensation to the law firm if you have to go down this route, but again, if there's a large claim pending, it can be worthwhile. I'm not going to recommend anyone, but Bot & Co cropped up a great number of times during my research as being a fairly trustworthy and reliable and actually successful firm. So there you go. What is EU261? When does it apply? And what are you entitled to? I probably shouldn't ask you if you enjoyed it. I hope you endured it, and I hope for those of you that are watching this having had a bad experience, it's been helpful in letting you know what your next steps may be. And as I said, I'm not a lawyer, so even though I would love to help out with specific cases in the comments, I'm really not going to be able to. So by all means, share your experiences in the comments, but I really cannot be responding with detailed advice to any of them. So thanks for watching, like, comment, subscribe, and if you'd like to support what I'm doing, there is a Patreon account, the link to which is in the description below. I'll probably pop up in a second with an update on my claim win, but for now, goodbye. So hello, a mere 8 days later I am back with an update. I lodged my claim on the 3rd of July and on the 8th of July, just 5 days later, I heard back from Iberia and they denied my claim. They fluffed it up with some unnecessary words, but when they finally got to the point, they blamed it on external factors, so it wasn't their fault. Which is absolute cobblers, it's a lie. As we have seen, there are very few external factors that allow an operator to shift responsibility, and I saw none of them at play on the day I travelled. The plane wasn't fit to fly, that's 100% down to Iberia, not to anyone external. I suppose there might have been something going on that wasn't immediately obvious, but if there was, it's down to Iberia to explain what it was. They didn't, which annoyed me. I 100% expected this response, but it annoyed me nevertheless. So I tried to escalate it, and that's where Iberia really started to annoy me. I spent a long time searching their site as well as other external websites trying to find an email I could use to escalate my claim. And I couldn't find one. The customer service area of their website invited me to use the same claim form again if I wasn't satisfied. But that claim form offers no way of adding any detail, there's no text fields that you can use, so I would have ended up making just the same claim again, which I'm sure would have been denied again. There is a UK sales number, so if you want to give them money, they will speak to you, but not if it's the other way round. One of my patrons shared a hidden web form that he has successfully used in the past, but it would only accept a query if the trip was taken under an Iberia Plus number, which is Iberia's frequent flyer scheme. Mine was booked through British Airways, so it was tied to my executive club number, and there was no way I could make the system accept my form given the reservation wasn't linked to Iberia Plus. I did find emails for Iberia's CEO and for their head of customer service, but I thought it was still a little bit early to be pulling that particular trigger. So on July the 8th, which was the same day that I received their denial email, I did reach out to make contact with them on Twitter and on Facebook. These are communication avenues that they were happy to advertise. For 47 hours and 52 minutes there was no response from either channel, which was really starting to infuriate me. But then I got a response on Facebook. An invitation to share my claim number and a promise that they would look into it, which I duly did. And for the record, I did eventually get a response from Twitter, but it was 5 hours after the Facebook response. And less than 4 hours after sharing my claim number through Facebook, I received this email. Words, words, words again, but they approved my claim and invited me to share my bank details, to which they would send €300, which I immediately did. It's not arrived yet. I will expect it to take some time, but it does seem like it's on its way. So we got there in the end, but there are some serious questions about how Iberia handles these matters. It felt like they decline everything, citing external factors, and only actually look at the case if the customer has the nous and the IT skills to be able to find a way of escalating after the denial. Given that I don't believe there are any enforcement powers with any authority anywhere that can be used to force airlines to comply, it feels like Iberia has just taken a commercial decision to deny everything and worry about things later. I'd guess there were perhaps 300 people on that plane, so Iberia has a liability of €90,000 as a result of that delay, which I'm sure we'll all agree is a very large amount of money. But lots of people just don't know that they're entitled to make a claim. There are lots of Colombians on my flight, and even if they did know that EU261 existed, they may not have realised, as you now know, that they are still entitled to make a claim despite not being European. Let's assume that 75% of people on the plane didn't know they could make a claim. And let's assume that half of the people who did know they could make a claim chose not to for whatever reason. After all, the delay wasn't that catastrophic. So those people that did claim received a blanket denial. Now, when an airline authoritatively denies your claim and cites a reason, I think a lot of people are inclined to believe that, even though it was just a lie. So if you assume that 20% of the people who received that initial denial persevere because they understand their rights well enough and have the self-confidence to pursue it, that suggests that perhaps only 7 people out of the 300 are actually going to have their claim approved by Iberia, which is saving Iberia 98% of the liability. Part of me wants to congratulate them because they seem to be able to do this without consequence, except perhaps for the occasional grumpy customer like me who shares all of this stuff publicly. But all things considered, Iberia's behaviour is really nothing short of despicable. In the video I made about this particular flight, I said I would enthusiastically fly with Iberia again. This process has dented that enthusiasm slightly, but I still would. It's a good, not necessarily great product, but it is offered at an excellent price. If Iberia did pay out in full every time a flight was delayed, there is only one way that that price is going to be going. But having known my rights, of being confident that my claim was valid, and having persevered through Iberia's lies, I ended up getting about 85% of the price I paid for that flight back through this compensation. I really try to avoid stress these days. I had enough of it in my past life, but I have to say this process has been one of the more stressful things I've experienced since starting the channel. I only really kept going because of this video. If I'd have been doing it for my own purposes, I could very well have given up earlier. But I persevered and I won. I can round out this video with a smile, and I will have far more confidence to pursue a claim if and when I am next delayed. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Goodbye.